Oh no, I don't know if I'm going to be able to talk with this on. Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Crue Trime, where I will ruin your faith in humanity faster than a Florida man headline. If you're new here, hi! My name is Sarah and I am your host, your proxy therapist, and emotional support storyteller. Normally, I put my makeup on while I tell you the terrible story, but today, it's been a long day, okay? I worked all day, I went to the gym, there's a lot of sweat happening, so I am gonna do treats for my face. So I'm going to take my makeup off and then do like a bajillion step skincare, because why not? I will also remember to link my pajamas. These ones have little chicken nuggets from McDonald's on them. And I will also link all of the stuff that I put on my face, so stay tuned for that. Today's story takes us to Austin, Texas in December of 1991. This story has been highly, highly requested, and it has popped back into the news recently. So it's really the perfect time to get into it. This is the story of the yogurt shop murders. So, frozen yogurt shops these days are easier to find than like regular ice cream places, but in the early 90s, it was like a very recent innovation. My fellow olds will remember the name of a new and exciting frozen yogurt shop franchise called I Can't Believe It's Yogurt. So creative. Am I right?
Groundbreaking.
Anyways, so on December 6th, 1991, it was a chilly Friday night in North Austin. It was the kind of night where the strip malls glowed with neon signs and everybody was gearing up for the weekend. And at the local I Can't Believe It's Yogurt shop, the crew of teenage girls were finishing up their shift, wiping down the counters, getting ready to close up for the night. Just before midnight, a call came in to 911. Fire and smoke was pouring from the yogurt shop. Firefighters rushed to the scene expecting a simple kitchen accident or maybe a short circuit of some kind. But the moment they stepped inside, it was clear that this was not an accident. And once they got to the back of the store, they found the unthinkable. 4 teenage girls had been murdered execution style, and one of them had been sexually assaulted. The fire had been set deliberately, and the scene was so badly damaged from, the fire and smoke and water that the investigators could barely make sense of it all. Most of the evidence was gone, melted, burned, or washed away by the water used to put out the fire. The police chief later said that it was the most horrific crime scene he'd ever seen, and he was not exaggerating. Austin at that time was known as a quirky, sleepy college town, and they were in shock. This wasn't just a crime, it was chaos. Parents started picking their kids up from after-school jobs early, fast food joints, movie theaters, anywhere with a late night shift, all suddenly felt dangerous. The girls that were at I Can't Believe It's Yogurt that night were all friends, some closer than others, but all part of that small, familiar high school orbit where your world is mostly made up of school crushes and plans that feel huge because they're yours. They were smart, funny, and normal in that perfectly 90s way. Scrunchies, babysitting gigs, and hopes bigger than their town. So 2 of the girls had been working the late shift that night, running the register and cleaning up before closing, and the other 2 had just stopped in just to hang out. They were doing everything right. They weren't out partying, they weren't sneaking off, they were closing up a yogurt shop on a Friday night. It's like the safest, most vanilla job imaginable. Literally. Born in August 1974, Eliza Thomas was responsible and dependable. She was the kind of teenager every boss dreams of hiring. Steady, mature beyond her years. She juggled school and part-time work where she was saving up for a car and planning for college, and she wanted to eventually study business. Eliza was the kind of girl who had her act together early. She was reliable, witty, the kind of person that you would ask for her notes if you missed class. Born in May of 1975, Jennifer Harbison was Eliza's friend and co-worker that night. Jennifer dreamed of becoming a veterinarian one day, and she was an active member of her school's Future Farmers of America chapter. She really had a heart for animals, and especially horses. Jennifer was vibrant, social, protective, especially of her younger sister, who was also there that night. So Jennifer's younger sister, Sarah, had come to the shop that evening to keep her sister company before heading home. Also, she was going to get a ride home. She looked up to Jennifer in that classic little sister way, equal parts admiration and occasional exasperation. Sarah was sharp, full of energy, and, still kind of figuring out her place in the world. She was also part of FFA, and she was a natural leader, outgoing and curious, with a sense of humor that made her instantly likable. The youngest of the group, Amy Ayers, was born in May of 1977. She was the type of girl who could make a joke out of anything. Amy also loved animals, and she had a horse of her own that she doted on constantly. She was supposed to spend the night with Sarah, who was her best friend. Sarah was Jennifer's younger sister. So each of the girls had something going for them, ambitions, quirks, dreams. They were living ordinary teenage lives that should have stretched into adulthood, relationships, messy apartments with IKEA furniture. Austin, Texas in the early 90s wasn't some dangerous metropolis. It was still just kind of a college town with more guitars than guns. And that night was like any other night. There was laughter, chatter, probably music from the radio playing in the back room. But the next morning, Austin woke up to a nightmare, with smoke still curling from the ruins and 4 young lives stolen. The on-duty homicide investigator that night was Detective John Jones, a family man himself. He pledged to the parents of the victims to never give up on the case.
We told them what we could, and I assured them that we would keep them apprised as to everything that was happening, and we did. I kind of made a promise to them. The next time they saw me with that green and white shirt on, that was a signal to them that, we knew who did it.
So after the fire was extinguished and the police arrived to survey the crime scene, it was obviously arson and homicide. Initial observations, and later enforced with lab work, suggested that there was 2 different handguns used that night, a .22 and a .380. And whoever did this likely exited out of the back of the store because that door was found open. Okay, so with the cash area disturbed and the shop torched, the early narrative hardened around robbery turned massacre. It was a simple story that fit the scene, but ended up aging terribly. Investigators also noted that whatever the motive, the arson obliterated most of the physical evidence that would have anchored the case. Remember, it's 1991. There's no cameras, no metadata. The point of sale wasn't even digital. Everything was analog, which makes backtracking movements and timing a mess. So in the immediate days after the incident, detectives fanned out across West Anderson Lane, and within hours they began chasing 2 early reoccurring leads. Recurring. One was a man who was let into the back to use the restroom about an hour before closing. And it was possibly the same person who could have propped that back door open, and maybe that's how they snuck in. And second was a couple who left the shop just before closing, and they remember seeing a pair of guys sitting at a table looking really sketchy. The case started bleeding out after about a week. The fire hoses had shifted debris and possibly the bodies, leaving investigators unsure what was moved by the killer or killers and what was moved by water. Dozens of people cycled through the shop in those chaotic first hours. It's not negligence so much as 1991 reality. Crowd control at a multi-fatal fire scene wasn't what it is today. Bottom line, the scene was badly compromised. And the evidence log that might have saved later prosecutions was, at that point, Polaroids and vibes. The first big lead in the case came 8 days later at the North Cross Mall when officers stopped 15-year-old Maurice Pierce. He was carrying a .22 caliber pistol in his waistband, which was the same caliber pistol as the weapon in the crime. So he was hauled in and grilled for hours by Detective Hector Polanco and interrogated interrogator whose name will come up again and again when it comes to coerced confessions. Pierce spun up a story about lending the gun to 17-year-old Forrest Wellborn. Wellborn, when questioned, denied it, but then he pointed to other acquaintances, fellow 17-year-old shitheads Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott.
It's Britney, bitch.
Not that Michael Scott. But suddenly, the universe of local teenage boys had 4 new gravitational centers. Even so, some senior investigators initially dismissed Pierce as a storyteller, not their killer. As the year rolled over to 1992, the case went national, and the phone lines melted with anonymous tips. Dozens of people confessed, including 2 men in Mexico. That confession fell apart. Even a notorious Texas serial killer named Kenneth McDuff tried to take credit for the crime on the day of his execution in 1998. None of it stuck. It was chaos, and sorting attention seekers from viable leads ate up precious time. So over the next year or so, detectives ran down other angles. A known serial killer in Texas got a hard look but was ruled out. The bathroom guy and the 2 suspicious guys that were seen at the table that night, that story kept resurfacing, but it was just a lead. It never led to identifications. The absence of clean physical evidence meant the case was tilting heavily toward statements and memories, the 2 least credible things in criminal justice when the stakes are this high. As time went on, the case got colder. The Austin Police Department cycled through detectives, re-interviewed witnesses, and logged endless tips. The families held vigils. The yogurt shop became a permanent scar on Austin's map. And behind the scenes, a split began to grow between the investigators who wanted to recenter the case on these 4 local boys and officers who said, "We're forcing it without hard evidence." In 1998, as the case approached the 10-year mark, a formal cold case review kicked off. So what APD did not have was physical evidence tying anyone to the shop, but they did have interviews by detectives who sometimes fed information like crime scene details to suspects. It's the kind of contamination that defense attorneys dream about and prosecutors dread. So the names of the teenage shitheads, Pierce, Scott, Springsteen, and Wellborn, got renewed heat, and interrogations ramped up again. Spoiler alert, I'm only calling them shitheads at this point of the story just to, keep track of who we're talking about. We'll get there. Oh no, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to talk with this on. So after long interrogations, Scott and Springsteen confessed, but they confessed and pointed at each other. Wellborn and Pierce never confessed, but all 4 were arrested and charged with capital murder in 1999. From the jump, their statements raised red flags. Defense lawyers and later reviewers say that some of the details that they relayed sounded fed. The details had been molded and fear had been leveraged. Austin PD's interrogation culture at that era comes under the microscope, especially given separate cases where tactics by certain investigators were later criticized as coercive. So what about that gun that they found on Pierce? Well, ballistics matter in a case with a burned out scene. That .22 revolver that was tied to Pierce didn't save the state's theory because testing conducted around 2000-2001 timeframe failed to tie that weapon to the killings. So the prosecution's center of gravity kept drifting back to the confessions. The problematic confession, that is. So publicly, the theory became that the 2 of them did the thing inside, one waited outside, and one just supplied the gun. But remember, that's just a theory. There's literally no forensic evidence to support any of that. And the initial interrogations from 1991 were not recorded, of course. So there's no way to know what the investigators said to them during those interrogations, or what was fed to them. A Travis County grand jury no-billed Forrest Wellborn, meaning they declined to indict him at all. And the charges against Maurice Pierce were later dropped for lack of evidence. Now, by the time the four guys were questioned again 8 years later, the case had blown up nationally, so the details were essentially public knowledge. Typically in a case like that, whoever was there would know things that would not have been released to the public, and they weren't getting any of that from these four guys. The four men were interrogated for days, literally, until somebody finally cracked.
I don't know if this is real or not, or if this is, Michael, it's real. It's okay. You can present it to us any way you want, but it's real. Mike, look at me. You're remembering what happened because you were inside there, right? You're remembering what happened. I don't honestly remember going in the building.
I mean, it really meets the definition of a coerced confession if you ask me.
I'm getting pretty sick of everyone pretending that titties aren't the most important thing in the world anymore.
I did it.
So, first of all, it's a small interview room, and fluorescent lights make anybody look guilty. The detectives who lived this case for years were determined to end it today. And across from them are guys in their 20s by this time who don't have lawyers, don't know the rules. They don't fully understand that the room is a machine designed to produce words the state can use against them. So police are legally allowed to lie to a suspect during questioning. Things like, your friend already told us everything, so confess now before you run out of time to save yourself. But what they're not allowed to do is refuse legal counsel. So there was a point where Springsteen asked about getting a lawyer, but the police interrogating him just changed the subject.
No, don't like that.
So anyway, by 2001, the first trial kicked off, and this was the one for Robert Springsteen. Remember, there is no physical evidence linking him to the shop, so the trial just leaned really heavily on his confession and what Michael Scott said about him. The jury convicted him, and Springsteen was sentenced to death. I'm leaving out a lot of details about the trial. Yes, we will come back to it. Okay. A year later, Michael Scott landed in the courtroom for his trial, and it was the same problem. There were no forensics that put him in the yogurt shop. The state again relied on his own words and Springsteen's words about him to stitch together this narrative of a botched robbery, a sexual assault, and arson. Scott was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The two central convictions rested almost entirely on statements. By 2003, Austin finally had two convictions, at least on paper. In reality, the foundation was cracked. A compromised scene, no clean evidence tying any of the four to the shop, and tape-recorded confessions increasingly criticized for how they were obtained. Appellate lawyers were sharpening knives over a constitutional problem that the trials danced all around, using one non-testifying co-defendant's statement against another. This was a confrontation clause time bomb waiting to go off. So both Springsteen and Scott, now in maximum security prison, maintained their original 1991 stories. It wasn't them, they weren't there, they didn't do it. By the mid-2000s, the rules on using one suspect's words against another were changing fast. Appellate courts were souring on trials that leaned on a non-testifying co-defendant's statement to convict someone else. Now that issue became front and center in the yogurt shop trials, and it blew everything up. So in 2006, Texas's how do you ownership Texas? The highest criminal court in Texas. So in 2006, the highest criminal court in Texas tossed Robert Springsteen's conviction. They ruled that the trial violated the confrontation clause because jurors heard Michael Scott's statements without any chance for cross-examination. So this ruling did not declare him innocent, but it did say that the conviction could not stand. A year later, the same court did the same thing to Michael Scott's conviction, again because the state had used Springsteen's statements against him. And suddenly, Austin's marquee case was back to square one. So in 2008, when preparing for a retrial, the state sent evidence for updated DNA testing. Much of the crime scene was a wreck. Fingerprints were not happening, and the evidence was essentially ruined. But one of the victims had been sexually assaulted, and the investigators did have the foresight to collect and preserve that evidence, DNA evidence. The results landed like a brick. Male DNA that was recovered from one of the victims did not match Springsteen, Scott, or the two original suspects.
What?
In April of 2008, that fact was brought formally before the courts, and the evidence excluded all four men, which underscored the fact that the unknown male contributor was unidentified. So, with the convictions overturned and the new DNA evidence cutting against the state's narrative, a judge allowed Springsteen and Scott out on bond while prosecutors tried to figure it out. So, after nearly a decade behind bars between them, the two men stepped out of jail on June 24th, 2009. 4 months later, prosecutors moved to dismiss all charges, and the DA told the court that she wasn't ready to retry the case. Investigators still had DNA questions to pursue, and no clean forensics tying either man to the shop. The judge granted the motion, and the case against Springsteen and Scott collapsed for good. Now, years later, advocacy groups would still point to this particular case as like a textbook example of why confession-only cases, especially ones marinated in questionable tactics, can't carry the weight alone. So when the charges in this case were dismissed in 2009, the case didn't end, it just got quieter. The families kept holding vigils and pushing for real answers. The original 4 young men scattered. One rebuilt a private life, one moved out of state, and one actually died in 2010 after a violent encounter with Austin police during a traffic stop. Ugh. Behind the scenes, detectives kept resubmitting evidence as lab science improved, especially YSTR testing and genealogical methods that had cracked other infamous cold cases. Now, nothing public for years, but the message to the families was steady. We're still working it. Now, the absence of clean, usable DNA in the 2000s was a brick wall, but better tools opened windows. And that leads us to right now. So this case is now back in the lead spot on the news after a major breakthrough was announced a couple weeks ago. Austin police have finally identified a suspect, Robert Eugene Brashers. He's an interstate offender who died by suicide in 1999 during a police standoff in Missouri. So a combination of modern DNA, including YSTR and genetic genealogy, and ballistic testing did what decades of interviews couldn't. So DNA from the scene, including material that was recovered from underneath one of the victim's fingernails, specifically matched Robert Brashers. And separately, a shell casing recovered from the yogurt shop scene in Austin matched a 1998 unsolved case in Kentucky that was connected to Robert Brashers. In multiple cases later linked to him, investigators documented hallmarks that you see in the Austin case. Entering homes or businesses while armed, binding the victims, often with their own clothing, sexual assaults of younger victims, shots to the head, moving fast and alone and leaving little behind. Austin police held a press conference to make the announcement about the new discovery. The new forensics points to one man.
We now have evidence linking a specific individual to this case, Robert Eugene Brashers. The only physical evidence located at that scene has been matched to him.
It wasn't until very recently when the South Carolina State Lab solved one of their own cold cases and entered their suspect's profile into the database that we had a hit to our unknown male subject.
And that there's no physical evidence connecting the original suspects to the scene, and there's no evidence to connect any of them to Brashers. The families of the victims have welcomed that new science, and they are pushing for the record to publicly reflect that. So the presser was attended by family members of the victims and some of the original investigation team.
So yeah, amazingly enough, it still fits. Nod your head up and down. It still fits.
Yes, sir.
I told the families, well, when you see me in this idiot shirt again, it's me because the case is solved.
This case began with a fire to erase a crime, but it didn't. It scorched the evidence, but not the truth. The truth just took the long way home. And that is the story of the yogurt shop murders. Let me know down in the comments below if you've been following this case and what you think about it. Yeah, so if you're wondering, I don't normally do 8 million steps of skincare, but if you're interested to know any of the stuff that I used today, I'll link it all down below, including these awesome jammies. If you have a Crue Trime story that you'd like to recommend to me, there's a link down below in the description box where you can fill out a Google Doc with all the dirty details. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for hanging out today and for watching this video. I really appreciate it. If you want to see more videos like this one, then consider subscribing to this channel before you leave today. I upload new videos here on YouTube every week, and you can follow me on all of the other socials as well. That is it for now. I will catch you next time in the next video. Bye! The name of us new... in the original... Oh my god. I'm running out of skincare steps. Oh, this comb looks so gross. Oh no, am I gonna be able to talk with this on? Uh-oh. There we go.